faculty member at Harvard Medical School and a clinical psychologist specializing in health psychology and performance excellence training using biofeedback and mindfulness-based approaches. Dr. Khazan is recognized as a pioneer in the area of mindfulness-based biofeedback. She teaches nationally and internationally, including at institutions such as the U.S. Navy Special Warfare, U.S. Army Special Forces, and the Stuttgart Opera and Ballet Company. Dr. Khazan is a member of the board of directors for the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, IMP, the Association for Applied Psychophysiology and Biofeedback, AAPB, and Biofeedback Certification International Alliance, BCIA, where she is currently chair-elect. Dr. Khazan is the author of numerous journal articles and 2 books, Clinical Handbook of Biofeedback, a step-by-step guide to training and practice with mindfulness and biofeedback, and mindfulness in everyday life, practical solutions for improving your health and performance. And just a little note for those attending for the first time, you can ask questions. There's a chat box to the right of your screen that you're looking at this webinar on, and you can raise your hand, ask questions, and then at the end of the webinar, when Dr. Khazan has finished her presentation, if we still have time, I will ask some of those questions on behalf of the audience. So without further ado, I pass you over with great pleasure to Ina Khazan.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the introduction, and thank you everybody for being here today. I'd like to start out by thinking about why are we here today? Why are we talking about biofeedback and mindfulness? Why are we talking about introducing those skills into our everyday lives, and why do we need to have this conversation? The reason is that we all have an idea of what we'd like our lives to look like for the next hour, the next day, the next year, the next decade. And we'd like our plans to go smoothly, kind of like in that top of that picture that you see on your screen, be able to reach our goals easily. But life doesn't work that way, does it? Life is constantly throwing all sorts of obstacles our way, potholes and ditches and challenges to overcome. And that is why we need our minds and bodies to work together in most optimal way in order for us to meet those challenges and achieve our goals with all those obstacles in our way. And of course, there is more than one way to do it. Today, I'm going to talk about the way we can use biofeedback and mindfulness in training our minds and bodies to work together in the most optimal way in building resilience and optimizing our daily functioning. I'll start out by saying a few words about biofeedback. I am assuming that most of you are at least somewhat familiar with biofeedback, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. I will spend more time talking about mindfulness, and then bringing mindfulness and biofeedback together, and then finally talking about 8 principles of integrating mindfulness and biofeedback into our everyday life. And those 8 principles are just a selection of the skills that I introduce in the book, and I hope that you will be curious and go back to the book to learn more. You know, this is just a small selection of the way in which we can integrate biofeedback and mindfulness into our daily life. So a few words about biofeedback. Biofeedback is a way for us to develop greater awareness and ability to influence our physiological and mental functions by using signals from our own bodies. This is just a short definition. And biofeedback is a great way to train our bodies to improve self-regulation, build resilience, ability to meet challenges, as well as improve our physical and mental health. All right, and now let's talk more about mindfulness. There are, of course, lots of different definitions of mindfulness, and you've probably come across a whole bunch of them. I will introduce one that I like the most and one that works best when combined with biofeedback. So mindfulness is pre-verbal awareness of the present moment with acceptance. The idea of that pre-verbal awareness is very important because it gives us a chance to tell the difference between our experience and then our interpretation of that experience. Because there is a difference between simply observing the sensations of the present experience itself without words, labels, judgments, and then our mind's commentary, its interpretation of the experience. Belgian artist René Magritte makes this distinction really beautifully with this painting titled Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. If you look at the picture on your screen, if this is not a pipe, what is it? And I know I can't hear your answers, but I imagine that a lot of you are saying, well, this is a picture of a pipe. And you are indeed correct. And if we're going to get very technical about it, it is really a projection of the picture of the pipe on your computer screens. But more importantly, it is the artist's interpretation of the actual pipe that he may have had in front of him when he painted this. And it's a really nice illustration of how quick our minds excuse me, how quick our minds are to name, interpret, and judge our experience, making it difficult to tell the difference between the experience itself and our interpretation of it. When first looking at this painting, we might have all said, oh, this is a pipe. And the artist is making a point that no, it is actually not the pipe. It is his interpretation of the pipe that was part of his experience at the time when he drew the painting. So it is crucial for us to learn to recognize and observe their experience for what it is, rather than what our minds say it is. Let's think about a time maybe when you've faced some sort of challenge, maybe an important presentation or a job interview or a sporting event or a performance of some sort that was really important. And the sensations that you may have noticed just prior to that experience or prior to that performance were increased heart rate, faster breathing, maybe feeling a little bit sweaty, butterflies in your stomach. So these were the pre-verbal sensations that you experienced prior to the performance. And then you might have a choice in how you interpret those sensations. The first automatic reaction that we're so quick to go to is, this is anxiety, this is fear, this is bad for me, I must get rid of this. Or we then have a choice to interpret this differently with a mindful response rather than the automatic reaction. We might interpret those sensations as readiness, excitement, adaptive response, which is really what it is. Our body's preparing in order for us to do our best in meeting this challenge. And it is up to us how to interpret those initial pre-verbal sensations in a way that is most helpful to us, right? And that mindful response of, this is my body working to do its best in order to help me do my best, is the most helpful interpretation of those physiological sensations that we experience before a performance or an important event. So in summary, mindfulness helps us pause long enough to choose the most helpful response to the present experience. It allows us to tell the difference between what is and is not under our control, and to focus on mindfully changing what we can. And then mindfulness helps improve our resilience and ability to respond to challenges, as well as our physical and emotional health. Now let's talk about combining mindfulness and biofeedback together. How does mindfulness enhance biofeedback? First, mindfulness allows us to make mindful changes rather than struggling. So if we find ourselves in a difficult situation, we may struggle with our experience, we might struggle with our anxiety, we might work really hard to make it go away, which as we'll talk about later in this webinar, is not likely to work. So if we bring mindfulness into that experience, if rather than trying to use our biofeedback skills to get rid of the anxiety, we use mindfulness to allow our biofeedback skills to make mindful changes and not get stuck in the struggle, we're likely to experience different results. Mindfulness also enhances our awareness and ability to attend to physiological and emotional experience, which is so crucial to biofeedback success. We need to be aware of what's happening in the moment. Mindfulness improves learning, planning, and decision making. It improves emotion regulation. And it also allows us to work with what is likely to get in the way of biofeedback success, such as automatic reactions to thoughts, feelings, and physiological sensations, right? Those automatic, oh no, I must make this go away, or this is bad. It allows us to work with attempts to control or resist, which will likely get us stuck in our biofeedback skills, or it might prevent our temperature from going up. It might prevent our breathing from being smooth and comfortable. It might prevent our heart variability from going up. And it allows us to work with judgment. If we find ourselves not being able to bring our finger temperature up in that moment, mindfulness allows us not to get stuck in the judgment of, oh no, I can't even do this right, and then be able to move on and eventually succeed. Now, how does biofeedback enhance meditation and mindfulness meditation in particular? Biofeedback increases our ability to self-regulate, which then reduces the intensity of suffering without a struggle and facilitates mindful awareness. So in other words, it makes it easier to accept experiences that may otherwise be fundamentally unacceptable, right? If you've ever worked with somebody who experiences panic attacks, right? I don't know if you've ever tried telling somebody who's having a panic attack to mindfully attend to it in the middle of it. They might tell you to go away in slightly harsher words. With biofeedback, we're able to help people just learn to regulate themselves in those difficult moments and bring down the suffering enough that they can attend to the experiences like panic, be able to stay with them, be able to attend to them without a struggle. Then biofeedback also increases body awareness, and it facilitates a connection between physiological and emotional states. It's a great way to show the people you work with that when you think or feel something, your physiology changes in response. Biofeedback decreases physiological arousal, which is so important in facilitating quiet awareness. That's important in meditation. It allows us to just settle down and be able to be able to be present in the moment. And then finally, biofeedback provides real-time feedback on the effects of meditation. So if you are working with somebody who is skeptical as to whether mindfulness meditation can be helpful to them, you can hook them up to biofeedback sensors, guide them through a meditation, and show them what happens at the end. It's a really powerful demonstration where people don't have to guess or quote unquote trust you that meditation works. They can actually see it working. And a really beautiful way to describe the synergy of biofeedback and mindfulness is in the parable of the lute, a famous Buddhist story describing the concept of the middle way. I like to tell the story whenever somebody asks me a question like, well, do biofeedback and mindfulness go together? Because biofeedback is all about doing things, and isn't mindfulness all about letting things be? This story addresses that question really well. So in the story, Sona, the son of a rich businessman, becomes a monk. Sona wanted to achieve enlightenment, so he meditated diligently all day long, attempting to experience non-attachment to worldly desires and wanting to experience the happiness that comes with it. But despite his diligence and persistence, Sona was frustrated with his lack of progress. He was not experiencing that happiness, that entire enlightenment, and he consistently experienced the craving for worldly things. So Sona went to the Buddha and asked him why he wasn't successful in his practice. The Buddha answered, Sona, are you not a skilled player of the flute? Sona answered, yes, I am. And then the Buddha asked Sona, when you play the flute, if its strings are too tight, was the lute tuneful and easy to play? No, said Sona. And then the Buddha went on, when the strings of the lute are too loose, is the lute tuneful and easy to play? No, it's not, answered Sona. And when the strings of your lute were adjusted just right, not too tight, not too loose, is your lute tuneful and easy to play? Yes, answered Sona. So, said the Buddha, Sona, just like the strings of the lute, if you strain too hard or try to achieve your goal by force, you will fail. And if you don't try at all, you will fail too. Therefore, Sona, you should find a balance between having a sense of purpose and moving forward and exploring the moment the way it is. So biofeedback and mindfulness together provide us with that middle way, finding the balance between goal-directed action, which is biofeedback, and letting go, which is mindfulness, like tuning the strings of a lute, not too tight, not too loose. Okay. And let me now talk about the 8 principles of integrating mindfulness and biofeedback into your everyday life. The first principle is the stop and smell the coffee principle. And that's just mindful observation. We're talking about that pre-verbal awareness of the present moment before interpretation or evaluation. This non-judgmental observation allows us to tell the difference between what we can and cannot change, so that we can focus on what is under our control and what is changeable. So with mindful observation, we're just staying in the present moment, attending to the pre-verbal part of our experience before words and thoughts and judgments and evaluations come into play. The second principle is the label maker principle. And the skill here is labeling. And that is giving a non-judgmental label to your present experience. Using non-judgmental labeling actually changes the brain pathways involved in responding to the present experience. Normally, what happens when you're having a difficult experience is your fight or flight center, or the amygdala, becomes highly activated. And creating a situation where your actions may feel out of control, because the amygdala's job is to get you out of danger. So it acts almost outside of your conscious control just to get you out of danger, oftentimes making us do things or say things that we didn't actually mean to say or do. And in those difficult moments, the activity of the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for emotion regulation and ability to choose behavior, becomes lessened, preventing us from being able to make choices and decisions that are helpful to us in those difficult situations. So the process of labeling, just giving a short, non-judgmental label to your experience in imaging studies, is associated with less activity in the amygdala, so less of that fight or flight response that may be out of your control, and more activity in the prefrontal cortex, which helps us regulate emotion and choose behavior. So labeling quite literally enables us to pause long enough to figure out what to do next, rather than reacting automatically to the present experience, potentially getting us into trouble by saying or doing things that we didn't actually mean to say or do. The white bear principle. And this is, we're talking about giving up control over the uncontrollable. Daniel Wagner at Harvard conducted a study a couple of decades ago where he asked a bunch of students to not think about the white bear. Maybe let's all do that together. Spend a few moments not thinking about the white bear. This one. And even though I can't see or hear you, I imagine that a lot of you are having little white bears running around. You can't stop thinking about the bear, and the harder you try, the more bears there are. The point here is that we do not have control over our thoughts. And even though we hear the helpful advice of, oh, just don't think about it all the time, right? When we're having a hard time with something, when we're having trouble letting go of difficult thoughts, our well-meaning, compassionate friends and family might say, oh, it's not a big deal, just don't think about it. And of course, the more we try, the more we can't stop thinking about it. And then it just feels like everybody else has a secret to not thinking about stuff. Everybody else has a secret to controlling their thoughts, and we don't, and we just don't know how to do it. The good news is nobody actually knows how to do it. We just all keep thinking that we should be able to. And the same thing goes for our feelings. Studies by Roy Baumeister and his student Matthew Gayot show us just how that works. So in the first study, Roy Baumeister took a bunch of people and asked them to watch a clip from a movie, Terms of Endearment, in which a young mother is dying and saying goodbye to her children. It is a really difficult movie clip to watch in case you haven't seen it. It's a tearjerker, really sad. So half the participants in that study were asked to just watch the movie and have their experience as it is, and the other half were asked to watch the movie clip and suppress and control their emotional experience. And then afterwards, both groups were asked to solve a difficult puzzle. What they found was that, of course, people weren't particularly successful in controlling and suppressing their emotions, and what's more, those that attempted to control and suppress their emotions failed at solving that difficult puzzle much more than the participants who were allowed to have their emotions as they were. So those attempts to control our emotions not only don't succeed, but they also drain us of resources. So then Matthew Gayot decided to explore what are those resources that get used up in those futile attempts to control the uncontrollable. And he conducted a similar study where he asked people to watch movie clips having their normal reaction and controlling and suppressing their emotions. And he also measured participants' blood sugar levels before watching the movie clip and then right after watching the movie clip. And what he found is that people who attempted to control and suppress their emotional experiences had blood sugar levels that were significantly lower than their own initial baseline and than the blood sugar levels of the people who were allowed to just watch the movie clip the way it was. So the time to blood sugar levels for the group that was not controlling their emotional experiences. And this group as well was asked to solve a difficult puzzle. And again, those who suppressed and controlled their emotional experience were not nearly as successful in that puzzle than the group that was allowed to have their emotional experiences as it was. So what this means is that our futile efforts to control the uncontrollable, such as our thoughts and feelings, quite literally drain us of the resources that could have been directed to what is under our control, such as solving the problem, right? So when we find ourselves in a difficult situation and we spend our time in figuring out how to stop feeling or thinking what we're feeling or thinking, we use up our blood sugar, which is the basic fuel for brain and body function, right? We use it up, and then there is not enough of that left to use in things that we actually could have had control over, such as figuring out what to do in a difficult situation. Mindfulness allows us to give up futile attempts at control, which tie up our resources in a pointless fight and set us up for failure. Right? So we're not saying that with mindfulness we give up all attempts to control. We're just figuring out the difference between what is and is not under our control, and then directing our efforts towards the behaviors and the actions that are under our control. And as we might be, trying to control our thoughts, our emotions, right, and maybe having a hard time, another potentially, well-meaning advice that we may be getting is, oh, it's okay, just take a deep breath. And what I'm here to tell you is, well, don't take a deep breath when you're struggling. Instead, use low and slow breathing. And here's why. As you see on that picture in front of you, oftentimes those deep breaths that we often take produce a really, really big inhalation and then a quick exhalation. And the reason for it is we often feel like we need to get more oxygen. When we're having a hard time, the purpose of that deep breath is to get more oxygen. In fact, we actually do not need any more oxygen. At sea level, the air we breathe in contains about 21% oxygen, and the air we breathe out contains about 15% oxygen. This is assuming healthy lungs and healthy hearts. At altitude, while the air we're breathing in still contains 21% oxygen, but the molecules are spread further apart. So it's as if we take in fewer of those oxygen molecules as we go up higher. But we have to go up pretty high in order for the air to actually not have enough oxygen in it. All right, so sea level fairly close to it, I would say up until maybe 5,000 to 6,000 feet, we definitely have enough oxygen in the air that we're breathing in. And because we're breathing out about 15% oxygen, we're only using about a quarter of the oxygen that we're taking in. The point is we don't need any more oxygen. We have plenty of it. What we have to do is conserve our carbon dioxide. When we don't conserve carbon dioxide, when we breathe out too much carbon dioxide, right, with that really, really big breath that we often take in a deep breath, like we take in a massive amount of air and then we breathe it out too quickly, the condition that results from it is something called overbreathing, which prevents oxygen from being released to our brains, muscles, and other organs. This can happen from overly deep but not slow enough breathing. Now, I'm not saying don't ever take a deep breath. That's not what I'm saying. Just pay attention to how you're taking a deep breath. If you do take a deep breath, which sometimes feels really good, so if you're taking in a big deep breath, just make sure you're breathing out really, really slowly. Because when we overbreathe, our brains don't get enough oxygen. So the slide you have in front of you shows brain on normal breathing with the red and yellow portion showing high blood flow, and on the other side, brain on overbreathing with the blue and dark blue portion showing poor blood flow. So with overbreathing, we might decrease the blood flow to the brain by about 60%, which is pretty significant. I mean, this is with severe overbreathing, but you get the point. Our brains do not get enough oxygen when we overbreathe, preventing us from being able to think straight, figure out how to solve a problem, and resulting in these symptoms, such as shortness of breath, tightness in your chest, tingling or numbness in your arms and legs, sweating, muscle tension, difficulty thinking straight, foggy mind, right? All those symptoms. And these symptoms probably remind you of a panic attack, right? Or maybe anxiety, right? Which is exactly what happens. Every panic attack involves overbreathing, and a lot of anxiety involves overbreathing as well, just not to the same intensity and not quite as many symptoms. Oftentimes we might experience, our clients might report to us that they're experiencing anxiety for no particular reason. I just feel anxious and I don't know why. A lot of that is actually very likely to be overbreathing and not actually anxiety. It's just a physiological change that happens from disturbance in the mechanics of breathing. And if we're able to realize that that's what's happening, we don't get caught up in this is anxiety, I must make this go away. We don't get caught up in a struggle. We're able to correct the physiological respiratory process that's happening and be able to restore homeostasis. And when overbreathing is happening in the context of anxiety, when we are worried about something, which of course also happens plenty of times, if we're able to decrease the intensity of that anxiety by bringing balance to our breathing. And then we're able to mindfully attend to the rest of the anxiety experience without struggling and allow ourselves to figure out how to respond in a helpful way. So rather than focusing on deep breathing, which, as I said, if we're taking a really big breath, the exhalation needs to be so slow that for a lot of people, it's not really possible. It's just too slow. They can't do it. The good news is we don't actually need to, right? Because as we just talked about, you have plenty of oxygen. You don't need to take any more. So at rest, that big breath is just simply not necessary. If it feels good and you're able to extend your exhale a lot, it's great. Go for it. But for those of us for whom that's difficult, there's just no reason to take a particular deep breath. We don't need it. So instead, we can do low and slow breathing, where you shift the breath to the belly, slow down the rate of breathing, take a normal size inhalation, and then exhale as slowly as possible, either through the nose or through pursed lips, as if blowing out a candle. So here we're not emphasizing the depth and the size of the breath and promoting optimal breathing chemistry at rest. So let's try that together for a couple of breaths. Let yourself shift the breath to the belly. Slow down your breathing. Take a normal size inhalation. And then exhale slowly through the nose or pursed lips. Just take a few breaths like that. Normal size inhalation, long, slow exhalation. I hope that feels comfortable and peaceful. And if we do find ourselves struggling either with our thoughts, with our feelings, with our breathing, the idea is what we need to do is to get unstuck. And this is the quicksand principle. Think about what happens with quicksand. Imagine you are, walking around and you suddenly find yourself stuck up to your ankles in quicksand, which is that liquidy mix of sand and water that kind of sucks you in if you step in it, right? So let's say, you step in quicksand with both feet up to your ankles. The first thing you might want to try to do is take one of your feet out. Right? And when that happens, you're actually disturbing that liquidy mixture of sand and water, making it a little more liquid. So that's why you end up sinking more. And you are reducing the body surface area in contact with the quicksand, thereby increasing the pressure on the quicksand, which also makes you sink down. And then you're stuck. So what do you do to get out of quicksand? You actually need to expose as much of your body surface area to the quicksand as possible. This way, you're not liquefying the quicksand any more than necessary, and you are increasing the body surface area that's in contact with the quicksand and decreasing the pressure on the quicksand, allowing you to float. Quicksand is more dense than seawater, so you can actually float on it pretty easily. So when you just lay down on it without struggling, you're able to paddle to safety or get pulled to safety and move on. The same thing happens with our thoughts and emotions, right? When we find ourselves encountering difficult thoughts and difficult emotions, the first thing we might want to do is try to get out. And as we just talked about it, that doesn't work. We get more stuck, right? Thoughts become more persistent, and we can't get rid of our feelings. We just waste our resources on an empty, futile struggle to get rid of them. So the best thing that we can do is to allow ourselves to open to those difficult thoughts and emotions, as if floating on them and being able to then move on with the rest of our lives. And here's another thing about quicksand that I did not know until I started researching quicksand. And that is, quicksand is rarely more than a couple of feet deep. So, maybe up to a meter deep. So most adults can't actually drown in quicksand, even though we've probably seen, scenes from movies and descriptions in books where people just, disappear into quicksand, never to be seen again. That does not happen in real life. The danger of quicksand is not drowning. The danger of quicksand is getting stuck. If we find ourselves struggling in quicksand and we get stuck in it, when unable to move on, then we're just sitting there being exposed to the elements. Maybe there is no food, maybe there is no water, maybe the sun is beating down on us, maybe there are white bears running around. There are all sorts of dangers. And that's the problem. Not drowning in quicksand, not the quicksand itself, but being stuck in it. Again, same thing with our thoughts and emotions. Our bodies are built for experiencing anxiety and anger and fear and depression, all of that. Our bodies are built for all of that. And yet we think that our thoughts and emotions are dangerous for us, right? Just like when we encounter quicksand, we think that's dangerous. We got to get out. If we're experiencing fear, anxiety, or anger, we also feel, oh no, this is bad. I must make this stop. And that's when we get stuck. In reality, our thoughts and feelings in that initial stage are not dangerous. Our bodies are built for it. They exist for a reason. The problem is if we struggle so much with our thoughts and emotions, if we get stuck in them, and if those difficult thoughts and emotions become chronic, that's when we might actually experience some problems with our health or some more, long-lasting effects. Just like with quicksand, it's not the thoughts and emotions that are the danger, it's the getting stuck in them. So the best thing we can do is allow ourselves to experience those thoughts and emotions. Let them be as they are. Move on without getting stuck. Now, I've just been talking about allowing yourselves to experience difficult thoughts, difficult feelings, and while I hope I made a good enough case for why that's important, we need to have that knowledge in the moment when we're finding ourselves having the difficult thoughts and difficult emotions. There is nothing that we're going to be able to do to want our difficult thoughts and difficult emotions. This is the Brussels sprouts principle, talking about willingness. I'm asking you to experience things you'd rather not experience. Anxiety, sadness, shame, pain, right? And when I talk about it, the voice in the back of your head is probably saying, but I don't want to. And I don't blame you. Of course you don't want to. It would be strange if you did. And yet, as we talked about, that's also what's really important to do. So willingness is what's going to help you engage fully in your experience without having to overcome the barrier of not wanting. Wanting is a feeling. Wanting is not under your control. Think about it this way. Take a moment to think about a food that you don't like. Anything, just not something you're allergic to. Nothing is going to kill you. Just a food that you don't like eating. Okay, so hopefully you all have a food that you don't like. And Now I'm going to ask you to think about, do you want some of that food right now? The answer is probably no, right? You know, Brussels sprouts, is that food? You know, do you want some Brussels sprouts right now? The answer is, well, no, I don't. But might you imagine a circumstance under which you will be willing to have some of that food? You know, if that food is Brussels sprouts, you know, might you imagine a situation under which you'll be willing to have it? You know, maybe if you're, you know, if somebody that you really like, you know, a friend or a family member, not knowing that you don't like Brussels sprouts, makes you a special treat for your birthday. Or if you're having dinner with somebody, you know, really important professionally who says, oh, you got to try the Brussels sprouts, they're so good. Or maybe if it's the last food left on earth, you might find yourself being willing to have some of that food. And you're not going to want it, but you might find yourself being willing to have it. And so wanting is a feeling, it is not under your control. And if you're trying to make yourself want something, it's not going to happen because it's not actually possible. There's nothing I can do to make you want those Brussels sprouts. There's also nothing I can do to make you want to experience your anger, your sadness, your anxiety, your pain, your shame. And the good news, you don't have to want any of it. You just have to be willing, because willingness is not a feeling and therefore is under your control. It is a choice and a commitment to action where you decide, I'm willing to have some of these experiences. I'm willing to have some of those thoughts and emotions in order to be able to achieve my goals. And it will be easier to answer the question of, am I willing, if we frame that decision in terms of values, the guiding light principle. Values give us a reason to engage in most actions, especially those that come with difficult emotions or pain. Values are what we stand for, our chosen life directions, what is important to us in life. We can examine our values in order to figure out, why might I be willing to experience my anxiety or my pain or my anger? So you imagine a situation where, you know, someone is afraid of flying and getting on a plane seems impossible, but you know, they're planning on going on vacation with their family where you have to fly, and one of their values is, you know, being engaged with their family, being supportive, having fun together, going on adventures together. So keeping that value in mind, if that person asks themselves, well, am I willing to experience my anxiety of getting on the plane if that means that I get to fulfill my value of being part of my family, having fun, going on adventures together? The answer is much more likely to be yes than if the person says, well, do I want to get on that plane? Do I want to feel that anxiety? The answer there is much more likely to be no. So if we guide our decision with values, we're much more likely to find ourselves to be willing to experience our lives the way they are. And a couple of words about what values are not. Values are not judgments. They are not what we think we should do. They are not what other people think we should do. They're not what other people think is important. They're not what our parents taught us should be important to us. This is not what we think other people want us to do. This is really just what is actually important to us. And values are also not goals. It's not something you can check off your list as done. Right? So if your value is to be engaged part of your family, go have fun and go on adventures together, you don't ever just check that off your list. Okay, I'm done with that. But you might set some goals that are in line with that value. And one of those goals may be going on that overseas vacation where you have to fly. So the goals can help you figure out how to move in the direction of the value. But goals and values are not the same thing. And values are also not feelings, because feelings are transient. Feelings change moment to moment, and values are fairly stable. They do, of course, change throughout our lifetime, but they don't change day to day. They don't change moment to moment. They evolve and change over time as our lives progress, but not on a daily basis the way feelings do. Now, to help you remember some of these skills, and when you're teaching these skills to your clients, or when you're thinking about how to use them yourselves, I mean, that was a lot of stuff that we just talked about. And if you're having a difficult time remembering, wait, what do I do? How do I bring this all about? May be really difficult. So I've put together the acronym of FLAIR to help you remember some of these skills. And I realized that this works only in English. It's not going to work in other languages, but that might be a challenge for you, is to come up with something that would if you're thinking about this in a language other than English, thinking about how this might work. But let me describe FLAIR, with F standing for feel, L for label, A for allow, R for respond, and E for expand, awareness. So feeling is just becoming aware of the difficult thoughts, feelings, and sensations, that nonverbal sensory step, the pre-verbal awareness that we have talked about earlier today. Labeling is giving the non-judgmental descriptive label, which allows the amygdala activation to decrease, the prefrontal cortex activation to increase, and then gives us the ability to decide how to act in a difficult situation. So the labeling makes way for the rest of the skill, for the A, the R, and the E, because it allows us to pause long enough to figure out how to proceed. A for allow, validate, accept. Allowing ourselves to feel the way that we do because we don't have control over our feelings. And there's always a valid reason for why the feeling is there, whether we know it or not. One thing to keep in mind there is that we are allowing and validating the experience of, say, anxiety, not the content of anxious thoughts, right? So if you're afraid of, or if somebody you know is afraid of getting on that plane, and they're having a thought of, oh no, this plane is going to crash, what we're doing is validating the experience. Yes, it's okay to worry about getting on the plane. It doesn't mean that the plane is actually going to crash. But the idea is it's okay to feel this way. Whether you know the reason for why you're feeling this way or not, it is okay to feel this way because your feelings are not under your control. And then, because allowing lets you disengage from the struggle with your thoughts and feelings, you can now figure out how to respond in the most helpful way, right? You're moving away from the unhelpful automatic reaction and figuring out what is in my best interest at this moment. How can I respond? And this action is guided by willingness and values. And this is where a lot of our biofeedback skills come into play. We might be able to regulate our breathing. We might be able to release our muscle tension as part of the response, as part of a healthy, chosen response to the difficult experience. And then finally, as we've decided on our chosen response, or as part of implementing that chosen response, we expand our awareness, allowing us to attend to all of our sensations in the external and internal experience, so that we're not just narrowly focusing on the difficult experience itself. This allows the difficult experience to become just a part of the awareness and not its sole focus. To demonstrate this, see if you can grab a piece of paper with something written on it, maybe a newspaper, a magazine, or just flyer, doesn't matter, something with words written on it. And hold it up really, really close to your nose, up like almost touching your nose. And notice what you can see. Probably not very much, right? You might see some, blurry lines and blurry colors, and that's probably about it. You probably can't really make much sense of what's there in front of you on that piece of paper. And now take that piece of paper and move it away from your face and place it on your lap or on your desk. And notice what you can see now. You can probably see the words. You can read those words. You can understand the meaning of those words. And you can also see everything else around you. You can see the table, the desk that you're sitting at. You can see your hands. You can see the ceiling. If there are any people around you, you can see them. Right? There's lots and lots of stuff that you can now see that you weren't able to see when you were just stuck in that difficult experience. So this is what expanding awareness does, is that it does not make the problem go away, right? If that piece of paper is the problem, moving it away and expanding awareness does not make it go away, doesn't change it in any way. It just allows us to experience the full spectrum of what's happening, not just the problem itself. The problem becomes a part of our experience, not all of it, not all of our experience. So this reduces the intensity of the difficult feelings and allows us to implement the chosen helpful response. This is all I've had to share. I hope that you implement some of these skills and some of these techniques in your daily life. I hope that you will be curious to go to the book and read a little bit more about each of those skills, as well as a bunch of others and ways to implement those skills in various difficult situations. And you can always reach out to me if you have any questions. That's it. I will pass this back to Mark.
Thank you so much, Inna. That was a wonderful and very useful introduction as a webinar. And if you can just bear with me for a couple of minutes, there are just one or two questions from the audience that I'd like to ask you, if you can just spare a few minutes more.
Of course.
Thank you. Just before I ask those questions, I'd like to point out to the audience that Thought Technology is the sponsor of today's webinar, and the company is offering a 15% discount to attendees on any orders until November the 30th of this year. And also the Biofeedback Federation of Europe is offering a 25% discount on the Mindfulness software suite created with Dr. Khazan that runs on the Biograph Infinity software. But now to the first question from one of our participants, which is, are there any contraindications to pay attention to for clinical psychologists who want to integrate this procedure in their practice?
That's a really good question. I wouldn't say there are contraindications, but there's certainly indications to proceed with caution. For one thing, we need to have a good history of our clients, of their previous experiences, particularly of trauma history. If somebody has a trauma history, you want to go very slowly. Mindfulness-based treatment can still be very helpful, but you need to go slowly so that the person doesn't become flooded with traumatic memories and flashbacks, and you don't want them to just right away focus in on all of those really difficult experiences, because that's going to be more than they are able to handle. So you might want to start off with paying attention to fairly neutral stimuli that don't have anything to do with their trauma. And even though, being mindful of one's breath is quite typical in mindfulness, if the breath is somehow involved in the trauma, perhaps the person had experienced, not being able to breathe, or they experienced another person kind of squashing them, kind of lying on top of them, preventing them from being able to breathe properly, you don't want to start there, right? You would want to start with other mindfulness experiences, perhaps really focusing on external objects. That's generally the safest way to go, is focusing on external objects such as a smooth stone or a cup of coffee or a piece of chocolate, something like that. And then, once the person is able to stay in the moment with those neutral stimuli, little by little, move towards the more difficult ones. So just taking it slow is really the answer, and being careful what skills you are implementing with each person.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
Let me add one more thing. Sorry, I didn't realize I wanted to add one more thing. In the chapter of my book on mindfulness meditation, I actually go through some of the potential challenges that you might encounter, and I go through how to choose the best mindfulness practice for each person, whether to choose external or internal focus, and whether to look for sharp objects or safe objects, things like that. So that question is getting answered in a lot more detail in that chapter on mindfulness meditation.
Oh, thank you so much. I actually have one more question,
Mhm.
if you can, because it actually leads on from your answer to that last question. One of the participants in the webinar has asked, they have your step-by-step guide, and they were asking what is the difference between the book on biofeedback and mindfulness in everyday life and the guide, your previous book. Their focus is working with teams and individuals and how to make sure it becomes daily practice.
Mhm. That's a great question. The step-by-step guide is really focused much more on biofeedback protocols, on how to work with each modality of biofeedback, and then how to apply those modalities of biofeedback to specific conditions. The biofeedback and mindfulness in everyday life is really focused on, first of all, not just professionals. That book is intended for everybody, so the language in it is less technical. So it might be helpful, to recommend to your clients, or just for thinking about how to present some of these concepts to your clients. And the book is structured in different ways. It does present different biofeedback modalities, but that's just the first part of the book. And then the second book is really focusing in a lot of detail on mindfulness and mindfulness-based skills, and that those chapters are very expanded compared to what I have in the step-by-step guide. And then the third portion of the book focuses on applying biofeedback and mindfulness skills to challenges that we might encounter in life. So things like anxiety and shame and guilt and pain and sleep. So the conditions described in that third part of the book are also different from what I talk about in the step-by-step guide. And there, the conversation is really about how do you implement biofeedback and mindfulness together, but not from a clinical perspective of providing a protocol, but an overview of the kinds of skills that a person might be able to use.
Oh, thank you so much for the answers. And again, thank you for the webinar, and thank you for all the participants for attending, and for the BFE to organize, and Thought Technology for their sponsorship. And so with that, it's goodbye from me, Mark Schwartz, and thanks to everyone. And the details are there on the screen for contacting Inna, and you can all contact the BFE, I'm sure, if need be. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, and goodbye for today.
Thank you, everybody.